Good afternoon, everyone. If we could just get everyone to take a seat so we can get started. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Kait Bolongaro. I'm Managing Editor for Europe at MLex. And welcome to today's discussion on the Circular Economy Act, Europe's new competitiveness strategy and its implications for plastics. Before we dive in with our panel of speakers that we have up here today, I'd like to invite Virginie Janssens, the Managing Director of Plastics Europe, to say a few words. Virginia?
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot to PubAffairs Bruxelles, I should say. And good evening to all of you. And thank you for deciding to be here in person and contribute to the debate, and especially also to the panelists and the diversity of the panelists. I'm really looking forward to the debate afterwards as well. And Circular Economy Act, we're here today to discuss something that only a couple of years ago was considered a pure environmental affair. I think we all realize in this room as well, it's much bigger than purely an environmental topic. Circularity has become a large part of competitiveness considerations, resilience, strategic autonomy for Europe. And that is exactly why the Circular Economy Act matters. To be very clear, and I don't think I need to convince this room either, we stand at a critical moment for our industry, for Europe in this regard, at a time when the global transition to circularity is accelerating. Europe is slowing down. Plastics Europe's latest report, The Circular Economy for Plastics, which we published last month, shows Europe's annual growth in circular plastics production declined sharply from 13.6% in 22 to just 1.2% in 24. So we're growing, but we're not growing fast enough, and we're actually slowing down in our growth. The European converter demand for circular plastics is also losing momentum, falling from 16.2% annual growth in 22 to 4% in 24. So needless to say, many of us in this room are eagerly anticipating the 2030 recycled content targets of the packaging waste regulation to kick in. This slowdown is not just a climate concern, it is a competitiveness warning signal, and there I'm being very careful with my words. Our industry is under immense pressure, and we are dealing with structurally higher energy and carbon costs, a clear feedstock disadvantage, it's geology as well for Europe, increasing global overcapacity, and a surge in imports and dumping cases. I think at this point, DG Trade is really getting a burnout as well, as they can't handle the many cases coming their way. For many companies across the value chain, this is not abstract, this is an existential challenge. And yet at the same time, we need to invest, to transform, and to lead Europe's circular transition. So we are navigating two imperatives at once. It's the short-term survival with slow growth, and the longer-term transformation that is also required and needed. The Circular Economy Act can help on both perspectives. If we focus, and the focus will be important, the Act must come with clear, targeted, actionable policy measures that truly scale circularity, not just in ambition, but in reality, at EU level, but also at member state level. Laws need to be implementable, enforceable, and harmonized across the EU, and no more gold plating, please. So the focus will be important, but the policy coherence as well. The Circular Economy Act cannot sit in isolation. It must fit into an industrial strategy for Europe aligned with energy, trade, and climate policies. And we need the most homogeneous single market we can get as possible for our products, for secondary raw materials, and for circular services. We can pull this off with one circular economy, but with 27, it will be very, very difficult. Enabling policy framework alone will not solve our competitiveness crisis. This transition requires value chain collaboration today, I still hear many, in terms of market pull measures that we need to create. Who leads? Who takes ownership? Who pays the premium? Who invests, etc., etc. So this transition will require shared responsibility across society for Europe, and that's industry, that's policymakers at the EU and member state level, and even also at the regional and local level, and yes, also from our citizens and consumers. There will be costs in the short term, but much higher costs will be avoided in the longer term. So these are the investments that we need to take, the choices we need to make. Solidarity and political will be required. Communication to our citizens, consumers, we must make. We have to do it now if ultimately we all want to achieve those long-term prosperity and industrial resilience goals for Europe and in Europe. Why is Plastics Europe so invested as well in this debate in circular economy? Too often plastics are reduced to their simplest, most visible application. For example, the single-use plastics. Our sector is far more than that. We are supplying into Europe's economy and security, from healthcare to food systems to clean energy to mobility to construction. We are in many different critical sectors in Europe. And I think this is still an eye-opener when I have those conversations with policymakers where they thought they would be talking with somebody who represents a single-use plastic fork, but actually supplying with plastics products in so many critical sectors for Europe. So our battle is about keeping a strategic industrial ecosystem in Europe, and one that underpins many of Europe's most critical value chains. An ecosystem with assets that allow us to be strategically autonomous with a level of raw material production in Europe, and assets that will help finance the transition that we need to do. So the window of opportunity is still there, but shrinking with additional assets expected to close in the coming months and years. So there is that sense of urgency. So please, tight coordination within the European Commission, close collaboration with the co-legislators, greater unity and solidarity and political will and ownership by the member states and the leaders in our national countries to save the EU industry, right, and going beyond the national interests. So, in case you didn't notice in my speaking points here, it's not business as usual at this point in time, not for our industry in Europe, not for policymakers, not for Europe and its future prosperity. So we all need to stick our necks out and do our part. I really hope, because I'm already looking at you, please stick your neck out as well, but let's have an honest and fruitful debate. There are different perspectives as well here present today to really level that understanding and the different perspectives and come to some more broad policy recommendations altogether, hopefully aligned to help also our policymakers to come to good legislation at the EU and national level. It's really critical, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Virginia. That's exactly what I'd like to sort of start this conversation on. When we think about the Circular Economy Act, it's not just about environmental policy. It's actually also speaks quite a bit to the direction that Europe is taking. It's part of the competitiveness agenda, industrial strategy, the approach to economic security, all of these things that, are the buzzwords in Brussels that we've seen in von der Leyen's second term. What I find really interesting that I'd like to direct our discussion today is talking about, what kind of getting under the hood of the proposal. It aims to create this genuine European market for secondary raw materials, while also you're reducing Europe's dependency on imported resources. However, there are also questions, about how do we make Europe's industry more competitive with, resource scarcity going on and the future of European manufacturing itself in an era of, made in Europe as a popular approach. So that is a tall order, but I'm sure our panelists are going to be able to help us dive further into this topic. So I'm delighted to be joined by Catja Appelros, who's the head of City Business Support at E.ON. We have David Carroll, who's the External Affairs Director at Plastics Europe, and Koen, Rademaekers, the Managing Director of Trinomics. So thank you so much for joining us here today. Koen, let me start with you. From an economic perspective, what problem is the Circular Economy Act trying to resolve?
Can I take this one? Yeah, good. Okay, good afternoon, evening, all of you. So nice to see so many people interested in this topic. So maybe just to make it very clear, I'm the CEO of Trinomics and I'm also the president of Africa Circular. So a couple of years ago, we have set up a foundation that is really working only on circularity in Africa. We are currently active in 40 countries, and we see also the consequences of legislation from Europe to another continent, which is quite important. We are heavily working on ESPR, the Eco-Design Sustainable Products Regulation, which is basically the new piece of regulation which will have an enormous impact on circularity. So, which is basically following up of everything about eco-design that we know from the bulbs, that everything what you're using from an electronic point of view, but now also including environmental topics. What was said about circularity and the Act, it's indeed much more than just environmental issues. And that's what I'm explaining every time again when I'm talking to people. It's about employment. It's about economics. I'm an economist. I was a professor in finance at the university here in Brussels. And the key objectives of the Act are very straightforward. So first of all, market integration. But there we see already that there is a huge issue at European level because all the member states don't work together. And that's a very important element that I want to add here. When we developed the impact assessment that led into the ESPR, one of the tasks we had to look at was trade. And everybody knows who is buying online, everything is coming in, and we don't basically have the capacity to verify what is important into Europe. And we are basically having the possibility to inspect 0.0001%. And one of the proposals we had was basically that every country, I don't know if some of you know that, have a verification office. So basically looking at the quality, the standards and so on of all imported products. But they don't work together. So our proposal was basically that every member state was going to specialize on certain topics so that it could be distributed and increasing directly also the capacity. But from a political point of view, it didn't go through. So that's about market integration. The economic competitiveness is the one that was mentioned already by Virginie and by you. So I think it's very clear that we want to push forward the recycled elements instead of virgin. So the target is 24% by 2030. We are now at around 10-12%. So we have to double in a couple of years' time. And then the last one, it's about strategy autonomy. So it's clear that we are highly dependent as European Union. So also the Circular Economy Act should lead to less dependency. So those are the key objectives, and I will leave it here because I can continue. So because there is also something to say about the scope and so on. So the scope is still quite limited if you look at the Circular Economy Act. I would like to have seen it a bit broader because they are focusing on certain sectors like electronics, critical materials, CRM is becoming the hot topic, construction, packaging, textiles and chemicals. But there are many more sectors that we should take into account. Thank you.
Well, speaking of sectors, David, I wanted to bring you in on this. And, Virginia already did mention this, is that, the debate around plastics, you think of a fork or, a little plastic container takeaway. Is that too narrow a way of thinking about the role that plastics play in Europe's industrial strategy?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you look at the main uses of plastics, the second biggest use is construction products. So everything from flooring to insulation to windows to furniture. Automotive sector is a big user of plastics. There are 250, 300 kilos of plastics in every single car. And that's only growing to make cars lighter, make cars safer, make them more efficient as we move towards electric vehicles. Then everything else from electronics infrastructure, medical devices, agriculture, all key uses of plastics, all with waste management and circularity challenges, and all with the need to move towards circularity. And that's where we see a real opportunity for the Circular Economy Act to actually make circularity happen and work in practice. So we're still at a stage where almost 70% of plastic waste is still incinerated or landfilled in EU. That's despite the fact that the circular economy has been a policy priority for 10, 11 years at this stage. So there's definitely an opportunity in the Circular Economy Act to get those collection systems working, to get those EPR systems working, and really make circularity happen in practice. Also from a national government perspective, over the last couple of years, we've had lots of requirements on industry. You will soon need to redesign packaging to be recyclable. You will soon need to incorporate recycled content, whether that be packaging, whether that be cars, soon in furniture, mattresses, different applications under the ESPR. But as well as imposing those requirements on industry, we would also like to make sure that if you have to have recycled content in a product, that it's then obligated that it is collected, sorted, recycled. So that's where we've got lots of opportunity, and happy to come back to that later.
Catja, where does the energy sector fit into this discussion?
Well, I'd like to start with a very common misperception that plastics is good for waste to energy. It isn't. We don't want the plastics. We're trying all we can to stop it before it gets to us. It needs to be sorted as close as possible to the source in order to be recycled in the best possible way. But energy and plastics, of course, have very big connections. Plastics is one of the materials that requires the highest temperatures and most energy to produce. If we reuse it and recycle it instead, we will reduce energy consumption a lot. And that just there, we will reduce our fossil fuel dependence. So there's a lot to be done. And it's not just plastics, of course, it's other materials as well, steel, aluminum, that is very important to recycle.
And talking about the overall ambitions that, Europe, the choices that Europe is making, the Circular Economy Act is expected to deliver on several objectives. It's quite a key piece of legislation, especially for the sectors we're talking about here today. And, if those priorities don't always point in the same direction, where should Europe place the emphasis? So, David, I'm going to start with you. If the policymakers changed one thing before this legislation is finalized, what would it be for you?
I think it's not a silver bullet. I think it's a fundamentally important topic, and I think we see that by having people standing at the back today, the level of importance in this topic. For us, circularity, it's the future of the industry. If the plastics industry ever gets back to a stage where hopefully next year when you come back, we can tell you a more optimistic story and give you more optimistic figures of how we're back on track. That will be because we regain our position as leaders in circularity. But we also have to take into account the fossil-based plastics business. We have lots of key applications. We will still need fossil-based plastics long into the future, but also they're going to finance our transition. So just with one piece of legislation, we can't necessarily solve all of the problems of a sector. We need to look at that from a more holistic industrial policy perspective, balancing transition with the challenges that we face at the moment.
Koen, has Europe's focus on strategic autonomy changed the way that policymakers think about circularity, but also trade in general? Part of this conversation is also, dependency on other resources from outside of Europe. So what's your perspective on that as an economist?
From an economic point of view, I think it's very clear to everybody who is working already on the Green Deal since, 7, 8 years ago that we started with it. It's becoming fundamental, not only in Europe, but also in other countries. But I think also related to your first question, because I don't know if there are people of the European Commission here in the room, but we have enough legislation often. And we see that also at member state level. But often they do miss the capacity to enforce. So what is now so important with the Circular Economy Act is that the legislator is taking into account how we are going to enforce the act. And on what kind of topics or products or sectors we're going to focus on. And that was the main problem with the Green Deal. The Green Deal, as such, is a very nice piece of legislation as a starting point, but they haven't been thinking through enough what is really needed to push it forward. We have been working a lot with DG Reform, which is today SG Reform, that have been focusing basically on what are now the needs of every member state to implement the legislation that is coming from Brussels. And most people cannot follow anymore, especially the smaller member states. Imagine Estonia, a bit more than 1 million people. They have to enforce and implement and transfer all European legislation, but they don't have basically the policy officers to deal with it. We see the same with the industry. So fortunately, since now the new commission that have been looking at more industrial policy, I don't know if some people have been reading what Bart de Wever, the Prime Minister of Belgium, has been counting or explaining about the way forward. I think since recently, because we have been waiting for more than 20 years, to let Europe becoming more independent thinking, and that we are becoming incredibly independent, and that we cannot continue as such. Otherwise, we're going to lose basically all our industrial policy. As such, also, the Circular Economy Act will play an important role in that respect.
Catja, I'd love to get the energy sector's perspective on this conversation. You guys have obviously been, there's been a lot of regulation on your sector. Everything going on in the world, geopolitics, your sector is front and center of that. So maybe you can share a little bit of the learnings that your sector has had from, all of this and, what the Circular Economy Act actually is going to mean for you.
Well, I think, is it on? Yes. So to start with, electrification is very important to move the whole move away from fossil fuels. E.ON has done a study where we see that 80% of the most cost-effective decarbonization activities would come from electrification of transport, heating of homes and industries. So there is simple things to do that will reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And also, waste to energy is actually a way to further reduce our dependence. So we landfill in Europe 100 million tons of waste a year, which could be either recycled, which is, of course, the best if that's possible, but also energy recovered if it can't be recycled. So there we have a very good resource that we can use to further reduce our dependence. So there are fairly simple things we can do, and I hope that the Circular Economy Act and the legislations that we've talked about here will help us become better at recycling much earlier and better, but also making sure that we don't landfill, because that's actually much worse for the climate, that we instead use it for energy recovery.
Koen, talking a little bit more about, recovering, critical materials that can be used in a secondary aspect. Like, one idea that has been getting traction is that the secondary raw materials should be treated as these strategic assets, when sometimes they have not been treated like that in the past. So do you consider that to be the right approach?
For Europe, it's maybe the only approach. So, of course, there is a lot ongoing. If you see the kind of deals that have been set up now between Europe, some Asian countries, African countries, South American countries. So Europe is really working on becoming less dependent on one or two suppliers, because from a trade policy perspective, it's not very ideal to be only able to negotiate with one main supplier. So that means that all the imports of electronics, batteries, all the kind of things that we cannot produce ourselves, it's so important to be able to collect it in the right way and to recycle or repair it in the right way. So depending on the circular economy aspects that you can deal with. But we already seen in certain industries that, for example, the metal industry, where we have already now companies like ArcelorMittal and so on, where in 20, 30 years ago, there was nearly no scrap. today we are reaching in certain of these plants 30, 40, 50% of all the metal that they are producing is coming from scrap. It's a very good example that collecting it in the right way, using it in the right way, having also the right energy, because ideally you're going to use your arc furnaces, which is basically only on electricity, that it's coming from renewables. So that should be the ideal way.
I see both of you nodding there. Would you like to provide your perspective, David, on that?
Yeah, I think what's really key there is we take a value chain approach to the different sectors that the EU wants to support and looks at the raw materials. For example, I think there's a lot of political willingness to make sure we keep the car industry in Europe. But I think, as I said earlier, you've got 250, 300 kilos of plastics in a car. So we absolutely need to make sure that we don't end up in a stage where, okay, we've decided to keep specific sectors, whether that be automotive, electronics, even defense. But on the other hand, then we have to import the raw materials that serve those. So I think that value chain thinking is really fundamental to the way forward.
And where does that tie in with Made in Europe from your perspective?
Made in Europe is a really important aspect because I think we can't be naive on trade policy. There is made in Canada, made in China, made in everywhere else. Of course, we can't create trade wars either. We have to make sure that we are open to partners, particularly where we have reciprocal access as European producers. I think for us to be competitive, it also relies on exports. And sometimes exports have been an afterthought in some of the policies, and we want to be able to continue to export, not purely produce for the domestic market. We were, up until very recently, a net exporter as an industry, and being competitive relies on those exports as well.
Pierfrancesco, Maran, who's a member of European Parliament with the S&D, is just joining us. So thank you so much. I have a question for you to get you to dive right into our conversation. Has Europe's focus on strategic autonomy changed the way policymakers think about trade?
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I think today we have an opportunity. I mean,
Mike's up.
maybe now it works. Good. Well, today we have an opportunity. Circular Economy Act will not be the day one of something. It's a part of a journey we are making from several years. But it could be the moment to upgrade our politics on some secondary raw material that is fundamental to support, like plastic, like recycled plastic. It's the moment that we can focus also on increasing the demand. That is particularly important because you can't oblige to recycle. Okay, you can oblige, you should oblige to recycle, but you have to create a market that is the way we are sure that it will be used and it will be, and the market will be autonomous. That is what we are trying to do on many acts we are doing. For example, we took too many times, but we concluded recently the end-of-life vehicle, and it has been important. We have clear goals on how much recycled plastic we will have in the new cars in the next years. Maybe not exactly the same amount it was in the Commission agenda, but we have quantities. That is something I think the market needs. There's another aspect that is why we are now focusing on the Buy European, because if we have to import recycled plastic from Turkey or from China, I don't think it's our purpose. The main aspect we want to face is how can we be sure that the plastic we used in Europe and we recycle it as a market. So that is why now we are focusing on the Buy European aspect, and it is something mandatory in our strategy for two main reasons. First, we are sure on the quality of the recycled materials in Europe. We are not so sure about the same quality abroad, and also about the environmental procedure that are used. And second, now the world is less open than before on economic, and you can stay open if the other are open. If the other change their approach, you have to take it in consideration, and we have to find ways to defend our companies.
Catja, I'd like to get your response to Pierfrancesco.
Well, I think you're right. The question I have is, I mean, what will the Circular Economy Act and the new legislation actually be enough for the plastics industry to reduce the number of different types of plastic, to make it easier to actually recycle it properly? Will the eco design regulations help us make it possible to actually put the products apart to make them recyclable? Will it happen? Or is this just going to be a paper?
David?
Hopefully. And I think the steps that are going in the right direction. So firstly, I want to thank MEP Maran for defending the recycled content targets in the automotive proposal. It's something that we proactively asked for as Plastics Europe, and something that we absolutely need that demand as the first point that we want to ask in the Circular Economy Act. In other sectors beyond where we have market demand measures coming for packaging for automotive, but we need it for other uses of plastics, and it's not just recycling, it's also other sustainable sources of carbon like bio-based plastics we need to fit in as well. In response to Catja, as I said, for us, it's firstly about being a competitive industry so that we can invest. And just putting requirements on industry on its own won't do that, but it is a huge opportunity to make all of the pieces of the puzzle fit together so that circularity is actually going in the right direction.
Pierfrancesco, this, as you mentioned already, the Circular Economy Act, it doesn't stand alone. It sits alongside, the Critical Raw Materials Act, CBAM. Do these policies form a coherent framework from your perspective?
No. No, I mean, it's not always current. That is one of the problems, but because it's an evolving procedure. So we started with some idea, but even all the Green Deal, I think it started mainly about environment, and it's becoming environment plus economy step by step. I think some do it to water down green policies, honestly. Some other, we think that the only way to push is to consider that we have several goals. So we have to save the planet, but we have also to work and to produce in Europe. So it's not easy to keep a coherence on such different aspects, even because before COVID, before the war in Ukraine, we have some goals. Now we have new ones. For example, now we have a bi-European debate that was something that we couldn't talk about till 3-4 years ago. But even when we talk, we were concluding the end-of-life vehicle that is less than 1 year ago, even if we approved last month. And some of us, we asked not only recycled plastic, but European recycled plastic. Commission said it's not possible. We have a trade agreement and it's not possible. Now it's getting possible. It doesn't mean we will do, but it's something we can talk about. So it's an evolving time. That is why Circular Economy Act is not the day one and it's not the final, but it's a part of a process.
Koen, at the very beginning of our conversation, you talked about, Africa and the ties with Europe. The international element of this conversation. How are Europe's partners, from an economic perspective, perceiving, Buy Europe, Made in Europe, and this more push to, make things in Europe and get sourced materials from Europe?
It's still a starting point, so we are still far off. Currently, if you look at what is happening, for example, in many African countries, they are really going to the direction of becoming even more independent. Just this weekend, I came back from Zambia, where I had discussions with more than 12 different ministries, and where, for example, when we're talking about batteries, their idea is to develop a whole value chain themselves. We are talking about lithium-ion batteries. Because they have most of the materials, they are also working together with DRC because they have lithium. The other products are all based there. So that means that it's interesting from a European perspective to see how do we want to deal with these kind of elements where, because if you see what happened 30, 40 years ago in Asia, I was a chief economist in China for a couple of years. And it's quite amazing if you look at it from a helicopter view, what they have achieved, all these countries, in 30, 40 years' time. Yeah. And that's quite interesting from our point of view. How do we have to interact and do things differently? And that's the same what we have now to do also with the African continent. I think we have to work more closely with them. We have to develop also more added value in their own countries because there is an increase of population, incredible. So I don't know if some people know the figures, but a country like Nigeria, we go into the direction of 300 million, one country. The population increases so heavily, unemployment is so heavily. So that means that they need even more activities, and we can play a role there, which is beneficial for Europe and for Africa. Yeah, so, and then coming back on the last point, because I wanted to intervene, I think we need a level playing field. Yeah. So currently, when we talk about circular economy products, there is currently not enough a level playing field. Without such a level playing field, you are not going to increase these kind of things, and it will not come only from a liberal approach. That means that you have to give incentives, you have to come with regulation, you have to push forward certain products. Otherwise, it will go incredibly slow.
David, I see you nodding there. Europe continues to lead in circular plastics, but, there's also fossil-based plastics production has fallen. So how should policymakers interpret those two trends together?
The production of fossil-based plastics has fallen, but the consumption hasn't. It has been replaced with imports of fossil-based plastics, which doesn't really help anybody. So sometimes when policymakers, stakeholders, media, NGOs see those figures, they say, well, this is exactly what we've been aiming for. We've been calling to reduce plastics production, consumption. It hasn't happened. There are lots of drivers of consumption of plastics in all of the applications I've already spoken about, and the demand continues to grow in Europe and even more so in Africa and other places in the world. So certainly when we it doesn't really help that we just reduce production. We just reduce European production without substituting demand. So circularity is great, and we should really focus on that and call for that. But the growth of circularity is not really happening in the way it should be.
And Catja, we've talked a little bit about investments and, the policy framework giving businesses enough certainty to invest. What is your take on that? And, what's still stopping companies from investing in Europe?
Well, I think we do need to simplify and harmonize, and we need to show very clear direction of where we're going. As a sustainability enthusiast, you have to find the ways that you can to latch on to the current trends. Right now, it's resilience and autonomy. Let's go with that. So let's use that and latch on to that to get the right incentive momentum to get the wheels turning, but just make sure that we don't dilute the environmental aspects too much. In order to move electrification forward, we need better market stable regulation. That's the primary, and also market signals that help us move in the right direction, electrifying the industries that can be electrified, and so on. And also the grids, making sure that we focus not just on transmission, but also distribution, flexibility, storage, and we're hoping that will be part of the new grid package.
And Pierfrancesco, the Circular Economy Act, it's being discussed alongside, competitiveness, industrial policy. Has the ambition behind the legislation changed since its inception? since its inception? Like since, the commission put it forward and, has the ambition behind that legislation changed over time with these broader conversations regarding competitiveness, industrial economy and such?
Well, first, my impression is that some of the competitiveness asked by Omnibus is making things much complicated because you need sometimes a couple of years for an omnibus, and it's better to have not a perfect rule than another rule that has other problems, but 2 years of stops. So, but it's something also companies should debate because Commission moved on the idea of omnibus and simplification because companies demands for that. So it is what is really needed. Second aspect, I'm a great supporter of the Draghi report. Everybody talks about the part of simplification, fair. We are doing it, maybe. Draghi said that for the green transition, we need 600 billion a year, and nobody's talking about it. We are talking, we have several countries asking also to reduce European budget. That is something crazy, not for politicians, but it's because we are imagining that at the EU level we should do many other things to give a perspective to our economy. And without money for investment, I don't think it will happen. So in this moment, I think we are talking too much about regulation, but it is because we are investing too few. And my point of view is that we are losing position not because of rules, but because we have less public and private money to invest compared to the other continents. China, lots of public investment compared to us, and United States, and we are even lacking on the union of capitals. That is the other asset of the Draghi report that we are not creating. So I think we should go back to what we said at the beginning of the mandate and proceed in that direction. That is less member state and more a union that help our economy to grow up.
So I have a question for each of you that I'd like each of you to answer. If the Circular Economy Act is intended to strengthen Europe's competitiveness, how will we know it has succeeded? Who would like to start? Koen, I'll let you go first.
Do you want indicators or what do you have in mind?
However you would like to interpret that question, it is up to you.
So, but first of all, I think it's already very difficult to screen what is happening into the market. But there are, for plastics, for different kind of materials, we have reasonable good ways of following up the kind of material streams. There is still a lot to do in Europe when we talk about waste management. And so we compare maybe in Belgium, we have one of the highest recycling rates at European level, but there are countries where we're only arriving at 20-30%. Also still in Europe. And so we developed with Trinomics the circular economy strategy for Romania, and also in Bulgaria the same. So there is a huge amount of work still to be done in that respect. So I hope, and that's also what I said from the beginning, I think what is really key is that we are going now to look into the enforcement of certain pieces of legislation, how we can make things happening on the ground. And then also when we talk about data, because you need data if you want to see if an act has a certain impact, there is a huge amount to be done also in that respect.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear for us. I think that we should have one very clear, harmonized set of rules and ambitions. We should have the tools to get us there, whether that be funding, whether that be the enabling policies, the collection, the separate collection, the sorting that I talked about, the investments that we will need, and finally that it really happens in Europe and we're not just creating demand for imported recycled plastics.
And I'd like to reduce the import of fossil fuels, of course, and increase electrification. But other material flows, recycling them, I think are both good KPIs for measuring that.
Pierfrancesco?
Well, On one aspect, I would say that we should have an impact outside Europe because we can't go on the idea that it's something that happens inside while outside they do much pollutant things, spending less and entering our market. Second, the main idea is that we should have a single market and not 27, and I fully support it, but I want it not to be the minimum possible result. So we should support every experiment. My idea of a single market of waste is that if somebody authorizes something, the other should immediately recognize that new technology or that new system or contest it, but not I don't apply it in my country because we are not fixing the level for the next year, but we are pushing the fact that we should innovate in a single market system. And if we stop innovation, we lose all the opportunities we have, or if we need years to get them approved.
And just I'm going to stick with you, Pierfrancesco. What's the next political decision Europe needs to get right in order to make all of this happen?
It happens while we are debating about budget. So the budget defines not only our expense, but our idea of the future of Europe. We want to go on making agriculture, cohesion plus something, or we want to be protagonist of the economy of the future. If we want the second, we should double, triple the budget. Otherwise, we are doing business as usual. That is better than nothing, but not sufficient in this moment.
So the MFF may be an opportunity to look at that. Catja, where do you see the biggest opportunity over the next 5 years?
Electrification.
Mic dropped. And so, David, we talk a lot of talk about simplification and, the push through the Omnibus and, the Circular Economy Act and everything else that, the Parliament and the other co-legislators are working for. What will determine, from your industry's perspectives, whether companies continue to invest in Europe?
We need some of that regulation. We need that regulation to be predictable. There's certain discussions when it comes to simplification or when it comes to what may have been agreed in the past couple of years on will it actually stay? And for the investment we need, as MEP Maran stated, we need that market demand. And if any of that market demand were to go away, be reopened, delayed too far into the future, then it certainly doesn't help the business case to invest. So we need that predictability in the regulatory framework.
And Koen, what's the biggest economic risk that Europe still needs to address?
The biggest economic risk. But we are really dependent currently. So for me, that's a huge risk. But I want to also link it to what Pierfrancesco said. So for me, my organization or my company is working mainly for the European Commission. So we are working on regulation, legislation, and so on. But in practice, we see that the member states don't work well enough together. The single market approach, we really have to try to develop that much further. It will simplify a lot of things. Also for the industry. I worked in the past also for different industrial companies, and it's incredible if you are at that side of the market, how much legislation is coming in, how much administration and so on, and we don't work together. Even in certain member states, we have different pieces of legislation when we talk about federal countries. It's totally madness, in my opinion, if you want to develop certain economies. So that's an economic risk, is that we don't make it, or we make it very difficult for entrepreneurs to develop activities, and especially at industrial level. So if we really want to keep our industry and develop further our industry, look what happened in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s with our PV industry. We were the leading industry worldwide. We totally lost that. And that's because we hadn't any industrial policy. But in general, we and I said it in the beginning, if you really want to have a future for Europe, we have to work much more closely together. We have to diversify tasks between member states. We have to increase demands at European level and to simplify basically administration.
Pierfrancesco, I think I saw you wanted to jump in there. No? Okay. Then I would like to open the floor to questions. We do have a Slido going with the hashtag #PlasticsEU, so please do submit your questions. But if there is a question from the crowd, we have one here. Yes, please, if you could please introduce yourself and keep your question brief, please.
Thank you, so I don't have to shout. Fiona Dury from CFlex, the Circular Economy for Flexible Packaging. We're a technical initiative working on how to actually make flexible packaging circular in reality. I have a question for MEP Maran. We've heard that there is a lack of, I think it was before you arrived, there's a lack of political will sometimes in the member states to harmonise or to deal with some of the single market issues that you've just been describing, Koen. What would you advise, how can we help the European Parliament to push for EU legislation that will kind of help the Council along and to get the Member States to work together? Thank you.
Well, I would say we have two reports, the Draghi report and the Letta report, that are based on the single market. I think that companies, associations should push to realize it. It's no more the time to harmonize. My position is that the historical function of European national state is over. We don't need them anymore. They are too small for what the world needs. But it's my position, and I know it's a little unpopular. But on the other aspect, we can't have a different definition of what a waste is passing a border inside Europe. Circular Economy Act would fail if it doesn't solve this problem. I don't know how can it win, but it would fail if we don't do that. And it could be an occasion. I have the impression that Commission is really engaged on the idea that the base of Circular Economy Act is creating a single market of waste and the value chain around it. Let's see the proposal, and let's see if it will resist at the Council.
Oh, more questions here, yeah.
Hi, good evening. Gerard Kelder, I'm the founder, managing partner of Infinity Capital. We're one of the biggest investors in the circular economy. So we deployed about 100 million from our fund, an additional 200 million from co-investors, and the real issue that we see, we invest predominantly in Europe, is the lack of capital. And the analogy I always make is, it's like a train. So you need the government, and I think it was mentioned before, provide regulatory certainty, i.e. provide the rail track. You then need the industry being the locomotive to show, hey, we're committed to this. And that obviously, will then help unlock, mobilize the capital that is needed, which is what then fills up the wagons behind the locomotive. I guess 2 points, and I think it was mentioned, what is very clear is that we need certainty on the regulation side. So when we talk about PPWR, for example, we really need to stick to the timeline. We need to make sure we show penalties so that it forces the industry to take steps. And secondly, and I think that's probably being in the lion's den here with Plastics Europe, we need the industry to speak with one voice. I coordinated a letter to the European Commission, which was in response of about 130 brand owners, of a letter that was sent in April where they said PPWR needs to be postponed, it needs to be watered down, the economy is in turmoil. So I orchestrated a letter in response to say, hey, we're investors, we manage over 22 billion, we need to stick to our guns. I also tried to actually mobilize some other brand owners, some other petrochemical companies, converters. And what I realized, a lot of them being members of Plastics Europe, is, they're all over the place. So some of them are supporting it, some of them don't. And without a common voice, without consistency, investors, and this being a transition that will not be driven by the industry, similar to the renewable energy transition, because the incumbent industry has a conflict of interest, so they will never invest. We need, therefore, financial investors, and they will only come in when that train is up and running. So when there's certainty and indeed the industry shows we're committed to this, there's no way out, we're actually preparing our supply chain. So I guess the question, maybe that's more to you, David, how do you make sure you representing part of the industry that we actually get the industry to align and really support this, consistently and really demonstrate to financial investors this is going to happen and there's no way out? Thank you.
Yeah, really good question and a really important point. As Plastics Europe, we don't represent the entire value chain, but we do unequivocally support the PPWR. Yes, there are challenges, but they can be fixed, and we absolutely do not want a reopening of the PPWR. For circularity, that would be completely disastrous. We don't believe in today's European Parliament we will get the same level of ambition in terms of recycled content. So thank you for your letter. I can't speak on behalf of people who are not members of Plastics Europe, but certainly from our side, we support the PPWR and ELV and other circularity pieces of legislation. Of course, the focus needs to be on how do we get there? How do we deliver them? And then just in response to the point on funding and financing, yes, it's really important, but from our perspective as industry, there really needs to be a viable business model. At the moment, we're in a situation where demand is down, energy and carbon costs have exploded through the roof. We're being flooded with imports, sometimes of questionable quality when it comes to recycled plastics, for example. So the business model is just not there. That absolutely needs to be fixed. And then, yes, work with the various sources of capital so we can keep on the pathway that we need to follow and reach the goals.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the panel and the discussion. My name is Julie Peters. I work for European Bioplastics. So this is the association representing biowaste, biodegradable and compostable plastics. And I wanted to come back to the question of demand. Already I find it very important that this is also in the context of the Circular Economy Act being brought up. And thanks a lot for your insights on this. When we heard about the scope of the Circular Economy Act, for the creation of the market, the European market of secondary raw materials, bio-based and recycled content and bio-based content targets were one of the tools that were somewhat alluded to. However, recently I heard from a Commission official that this might rather be done in our sectoral legislation and not kind of, let's say, horizontal through the Circular Economy Act. So first question is, what would be your reaction to this? And then secondary would be, which other policy measures do you then see would enable the creation of that market of secondary raw materials? Thank you.
Who'd like to jump on that?
More for them, so.
I think there are lots of areas that can create demand. I think there's also the risk of creating duplication. If we take just the plastics perspective, we already have demand drivers in packaging. The struggle that we're facing when it comes to packaging is there's no demand yet because the targets are not in place yet. So how do we bridge that gap until the targets actually come into place and not just wait around until December 2029, then all of a sudden we'll get to 10 or 25% of recycled content. And we also don't have demand for bio-based plastics, which are, as you know much better than me, ready to go tomorrow if you want, and the demand is not there, or the interest is there, but sometimes it's about, I don't want to pay 1 cent more for this solution, which might bring down your carbon footprint significantly. And there are solutions that we can work on that. So in terms of where the demand drivers need to be, I think there's still lots of opportunities, even if policymakers decide that the demand isn't going to be in the Circular Economy Act ourselves. So as I have repeated earlier, that we need demand. But if that comes through the work plan for eco-design, if that comes through the various pieces of legislation that are already there, if that comes through outputs of groups like the Critical Chemicals Alliance, Circular Plastics Alliance, then there opportunities to create that demand, which doesn't absolutely have to be in the Circular Economy Act itself.
If you would like.
Just rapidly. Okay, rapidly here.
Here, you
Yeah. So what is really very important, if you look at European policy over the last 20, 30 years, if it's going from the market autonomously, it's taking a huge amount of time. So that means that if you really want to create demand, you really have to do something with your legislation. So not too complex, but simplified, but enforcing it. And the best example is eco-design. So eco-design, for most people who don't know, was started up 30 years ago. And today, everybody finds it normal that all the products, electronic-related products, are really not using a lot of energy. Yeah, we have even seen a decrease in prices. And of course, it has to go hand in hand with industry. So there are negotiation processes for each of the product groups. But if you look at it, and the European Commission never has done an evaluation of eco-design, because certain countries didn't want to do this, you know, the two big ones. But overall, if you look at it, the result is incredible and led to quite a lot of demands. Another one is GPP. So we didn't discuss that yet. Green public procurement doesn't work currently in Europe. So because it's not enforced. We leave all the municipalities, the provinces, the regions, the governments totally free to decide, basically, and they go for the cheapest price. As such, you don't create a market. And so I can continue with a lot of elements, but you really have to come in to make it happening.
Hello, good afternoon. Rademaekers is my name. I'm from Nova Institute and also I'm here for the Renewable Carbon Initiative. You mentioned holistic policy, coherent policy, focusing on the whole value chain. I'd like to do you one better, make it even a bit more complicated maybe, but bear with me. When we look at circular economy, what we find super important is to look at a whole holistic circular carbon economy. So we're talking all about plastic to plastic recycling, but with more technologies being developed and becoming more mature, we could also think about plastics to chemicals recycling, waste to chemicals. Do you think that that has a place right now in the thinking about the Circular Economy Act? Are we getting there? Is that completely a no-go because we want to keep plastics in the loop forever, even though we know that's not possible? So do you have a take on that? Is that being discussed? Do you think that this has potential?
I think it has potential, but we're not there yet. I mean, for example, it would be possible for us as waste treaters to not do incineration, but actually do pyrolysis instead, or also through CCS, CCU, use the carbon atoms to produce new materials. We're preparing, we're making sure that when it happens, we're there. But right now, there's just no business for it. But I think it will come. But we have to make the carbon atoms more valuable, much more valuable.
Hi, this is Lorenzo from MedTech Europe. I was wondering, tying it up with what MEP Maran said on the 600 billion euros needed a year to complete the renewable transition. How can the EU foster more private investment and not just rely on public budget?
Creating the union of market capital, for example, something we lack from years, and it could be a first step. The first step is the digital euro, but let's hope for the second. So.
Quickly here from my side. So in the previous life, I was an investor relations director of a big European company. And I started my career in financial markets. It's quite easy for an investor. They want to have return on investment. It's as easy as this. So previously there was a question about there is not enough capital in Europe. I don't think so. I think there is enough capital, but they're not interested to invest it in these kind of products or sectors. So that means that there is some work to be done to make these kind of sectors more sexy from a financial point of view. That means less uncertainty, more profits, and a clear view about the future. And that's currently not the case for a lot of these kind of sectors. So that's for me the key element for an investor is that you want to have certainty not for the next 2 years, but for the next, because if we're talking about investment in infrastructure, installations, we are talking about investments of 20, 30 years, because that's the kind of timeline we are talking about. Currently, often we don't have that kind of certainty, and as such, no investments.
Question back there. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. Really interesting and great discussion. So I'm Nicolas Tampone, representing Hermes Intelligence, a European Data and AI Act company. All of these targets that we are seeing are assuming reliable material flow data. The question is, where do you see the most serious data gap today in the making the Circular Economy Act work in practice and be really enforceable?
Reactor. So we worked over the last 2 years for the European Investment Bank, where they were asking us, okay, try now to develop a circular economy database with all the necessary data for all the different kind of sectors. So we have been working with basically all the institutions in Europe, starting with Eurostat. And basically there is a small unit within Eurostat working on circular economy items, but they couldn't help us. So there is a huge lack and also no willingness of the member states to provide the data on circular economy items. And currently, we still have that issue. So as long as the member states don't want to supply specific data on specific indicators needed by Eurostat, we don't still have the kind of information at European level, especially when you're talking about waste, but also other kind of sectors. On top of it, when you talk about circularity in different kind of sectors, it's not so easy to define all the kind of activities needed.
We had another question, yeah.
Thank you. Venetia Spencer, I'm head of public affairs at a company that's now called Perouge International, but you may know better as Borealis. So we're we're now globally the fourth largest producer of polyolefin in the world, and in Europe we're probably one of the largest recyclers of our own material as well. And normally I will talk about all the things you guys all talked about, so thank you for doing that for me. So instead, I thought I'd ask you a different question. We are co-signatory of a letter that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation published a couple of weeks ago, talking about key enabling issues that the Circular Economy Act could potentially do. And the one that I think has huge potential, but is politically probably the hardest thing we asked, is green VAT. So what I was actually kind of interested in this parliament and in this political climate, where do you guys see some of those financial incentives coming in? You talked about doubling the European budget, which I have to say, as Venetia, I'm all in. I don't know that we could get there either, but I love the idea. But how do you guys see this? The financial incentives. Can we make this possible in a Europe that's facing this serious and economic crisis, or untouchable?
Why we don't talk about VAT? Because you need all the member states in favor. So, as you can imagine, it's impossible to put together 27 people or state or something on the same issue. And that is why we are not used to create new European taxes. So it is an idea, but it's an idea hard to realize. There could be alternatives to VAT, but I would look into, because when you want to do something similar, but it's not the same, you can also have different results and not positive. So somebody's thinking of some alternatives, but I would check it better. And green VAT is a good idea, but I think it's so easy to find accounting saying no.
Very quickly, in this respect, some member states are looking into the topic. So we are just finishing a study for the Dutch government, RVO. So where we have been looking into taxes on specific products, where you have a clear link between the virgin and the alternative material. And where they asked us really to develop a model indicating what are going to be the impact of taxing certain kind of products. So they're really thinking about it, but it will be not with the VAT system. It will be a specific tax on specific kind of products.
Maybe just one additional point on that. When we do have those taxes, it's really fundamental that some of that revenue raised is used for the purpose. We have a plastics levy on non-recycled plastics packaging that member states pay to the EU budget every year, raises about 7 to 8 billion, does absolutely nothing to improve circularity of plastics packaging. It's just to fill a Brexit budget gap. So whenever there are those taxes, we absolutely need to make sure they go back. ETS could be another one that could help in this financing discussion that we're having, as opposed to just being seen as something that makes industry less competitive.
And then, of course, you have the EPR schemes. So there are very good best practices. EPR scheme, for example, for tires is working very well. Other ones, they are just an admin burden. So we have to learn about which kind of EPR scheme is working well and why. And what are the kind of conditions when you do set up a PRO, how they have to work, they have to be transparent and so on. So there are certain financial schemes possible to make it working, but it should be developed and designed in the right way and transparent. So
I'd like to just ask a final question. What is the one policy that would make the biggest difference to Europe's industrial competitiveness? Pierfrancesco?
I go back. We should talk more about investment and less about rules, honestly, and regulation.
Catja?
And to electrify.
Thank you. I think I've done my job here.
I don't think there's one policy. Sometimes we meet senior decision makers to talk about the struggles our industry is facing, and they list off the directives and regulations that they're going to adopt to improve the situation of the industry, and that just won't work. So it's more taking a more comprehensive view rather than saying, okay, we need one policy and that will fix everything.
I'm pretty aligned with David. So I'm working on policy for about 30 years now. And I've seen too much legislation that is not enforced. So for me, it's really key that member states are going to work together. They are simplifying things and they are trying to make it happening on the ground.
I want to add carbon pricing. I do think that's very important, consistent across the EU.
We have time for one more question from the audience. If someone has a burning question. No? Well, you guys succeeded. I would say that success is a panel if you've answered every single question that the audience could have about such a complex topic. So thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you here. And a reminder to please join us for the cocktail that is going to be on the right-hand side. But thank you so much for everybody for coming.